Hello, everybody. I'd like to say hello. Uh, this is Sammy, Sunni Sammy, and I have problems on my YouTube channels. I have 3 channels now. This is the first channel. And through my experience, my inexperience, I've been making some mistakes. So anyway, my email is ss2728 at net0.net. That's ss2728 at net0.net. And what I'm trying to do is link my other 3 channels together. But I'm back to this one. This is my original channel. But I do have a channel called Enlightenment Through Addiction and Recovery, which is the topic of this particular video now. So if you ever see that video, see any of my other videos out there, hit them up, subscribe to them. This station, however, Sunni Sammy, continue to watch this one because I'm going back to this one because this is where the rest of my videos are. However, on the other 2 that I do have out there, I will be I'll be putting content out on it. At the same time, we have a podcast coming up very, very soon. When I get enough content, I'll be putting out I'll be putting out a YouTube station. So, moving on to the subject and jumping into enlightenment through addiction and recovery. And what is enlightenment? And when I'm talking about enlightenment, I'm referring to like when we see a lot of the gurus out here and the teachers and the preachers, a lot of them will say that they're enlightened, and some will directly say it, and some will hint around to it and say it. What I'm saying, my point is this: enlightenment through the recovery process is that, very simply, an individual or a group of people that's in the recovery process can, as long as they follow their program, and it has to be a proven program of recovery. When I say proven, I mean, let's just say a year, and they've had we don't look for success rates in recovery. Well, I don't. I look at sustained recovery, how a person keeps coming back, how much a person keeps coming back. And also remember this: relapse is a part of recovery. Relapse is a part of recovery, and I will be covering that too. So anyway, enlightenment. What is enlightenment? Coming to consciousness. It's coming to, very simply, coming to a consciousness in some 12-step programs. It's called a spiritual awakening. But this is a consistent spiritual awakening, not so much as a person having a aha moment. They just awaken to, let's say I am a alcoholic, or I am an addict, or I'm a good person, or I'm a bad person. That's a spiritual awakening. But spiritual consciousness or enlightenment is consistent. That means that that means that every moment of a person's or the group's life, they're awakened to what's around them, mentally awakened, spiritually awakened, emotionally awakened, which allows them to be awakened in the physical. So they're awakened in 4 areas. This is what enlightenment is. And when I say enlightenment through addiction and recovery, why is addiction first? Because addiction is considered a darkness, a dark point. And I'm not saying it's the only dark point, but it is a dark point, a dark process. And I ain't gonna even say a point. I'll call it a process. Why? Because what is addiction? In most cases, addiction is what? Is obsessive thinking and compulsive behavior on a continuous level. And some of the symptoms are drugs usage, not addiction. Drug usage, alcohol usage, sex usage, gambling usage, overeating, or the usage of food, binging and purging, which is connected to that. Also, we got workaholic, people who tend to work. They just, work all the time. And so what is connected to addiction? Short story. How does a person become an addict? People usually, long story short, the gateway to addiction is trauma. A person will, or a group of people can have traumatic experiences and being said, let me look at my little notes here. Trauma, when a person has suffered, it says simply, a person that has suffered danger, the perception of danger or danger in their life. They've been exposed to some dangerous type situations. And let me see. I got a pretty good definition of trauma here. I was just trying to find it. But anyway, I'm not gonna hold it up. We're gonna move on. But I'm gonna talk about trauma and the three levels of trauma so we can get into addiction. Like I said, trauma is a gateway into addiction. And the first level of trauma is called acute trauma. And acute trauma, at this level of trauma, occurs when an individual or a group experience a single stressful or dangerous event. So it's a single stressful or dangerous event. Acute trauma, first level. And usually at this phase or level of trauma, an individual can get over it. They might need some counseling or get on some type of medicine or get some therapy, and they'll get over it. The next level of trauma is called chronic trauma, and this occurs when repeated and when a person or individual is exposed, or occurs when repeated and prolonged to highly stressful and dangerous event. So when the individual or a group is exposed to repeated, and it's the same situation, and it's repeated and it's prolonged. So let's say a person living in an abusive situation, or the group or can be exposed to a repeated abusive situation on a daily basis, regularly. This is called chronic trauma. And then the next one is called complex trauma. And this results from multiple traumatic events, multiple, to an individual or group. So a person could become molested, robbed, lost a job, lost a home. That's 4 events all in the same week, or all at the same time. This is chronic. And then we have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And this usually takes place in kids, or let's just say minors, where they might have been in foster care, or they went through some of the examples that I just gave. And what happens is they carry on this trauma throughout their lives until they get some help. Now, I'm going to put another name, or I'm attached to another name to trauma, and it's called pain, since trauma is a form of pain, mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. But I'm going to call this the pain body. And the reason why I'm calling it pain body is because it's pain attached to the mental body, the spiritual body, the emotional body, and the physical body. So we're going to call this the pain body. And further on down the line, in a series of videos that I'm putting out, we're going to see why I'm calling it the pain body. And what happens with the pain body, it develops what is called a or the shadow self for the individual or the group. And what is the shadow self? Very simply, the shadow self, like I said, results out of the pain body / trauma, where the individual develops personalities. Yeah, they would develop personalities. And inside these personalities is how the individual has saw fit to use to protect themselves with the trauma. Now I'm going to give a name. The name is called denial. It's called denial. This is how denial is one of the ways, not the only way, one of the ways how denial is introduced into the addiction process. And remember, addiction is a process, so as recovery. So the person or the group has developed this denial, and denial is a system. It's not one thing. It's a system of denial, and the person develops it in order to what? At first, as a survival skill. As a survival skill against what? Against the traumatic events, against traumatic pain that happened in their lives. So as a survival skill, this is what they have developed. So now we're at denial. We're at denial, and how denial is introduced. And hold up, I got my phone going on. Yeah, so anyway, let me deal with my phone. So anyway, moving on. And so now we're at the point of denial. Now, inside of denial, or the system of denial, what does denial consist of? Well, denial has to protect itself. Denial has to protect itself. And how does denial protect itself? Denial protects itself through lying, deceitfulness, rationalization, and justification of what? Of the behavior that the shadow self will exhibit in all four areas. In all four areas. So that being said, this is how the system of denial works. This is how the building blocks of addiction, of obsessive and compulsive behavior is formulated or put into action. Now remember, I said that addiction is not the substance or the symptoms. Addiction is obsessive and compulsive behavior. Obsessive thinking and acted out and compulsive in a behavior that's actually thought of in the mind. That being said, actually thought of in the mind, the mind will tend to rationalize or take over the individual or the group. So, some people believe that groups aren't addicted. They are addicted if they come up on, if the right elements or the right dynamics is instilled is instilled inside the group. The group will become obsessed and compulsive. It's called a riot. A riot. Yes, sir. It's called a riot. And we've seen many of them across the states, across the nation and across the world, wherever people riot for a cause. So that being said, let's move on. Now, another protection inside the denial system is called, now, what is denial? Let me back up and let me put a definition on denial. Denial, failure to acknowledge failure to acknowledge an unacceptable truth or emotion, or to admit into consciousness, and is used as a defense mechanism. And let me read that again. Denial, failure to acknowledge an unacceptable truth, or failure to acknowledge an unacceptable truth or emotion. So those two run together. So it's failure to acknowledge an unacceptable truth or emotion, or to admit into consciousness, So that's bottom line is saying a person refused to admit that something happened or didn't happen. And it's all connected down and not in there. Now, check this part up and let me back up. Into their consciousness. Now remember, I talked about a long time ago, I talked about enlightenment. And I said the difference between enlightenment and the spiritual awakening, what they both have in common is the individual or the group's consciousness. In some fellowships they call group conscious. So looking at a fact and bringing it forward, or looking at the reality of it, of the person or the place or thing, that's what spiritual awakening and enlightenment have in common. However, in the spiritual awakening, it could be a one-time event, where enlightenment is a continuous process. It's a continuous thing. A person is study being enlightened. They're studying their consciousness. And what denial does is cut the consciousness. So therefore, a person could never have a spiritual awakening, nor could they become enlightened. And that's why in this video, I'm calling Enlightenment Through Addiction. We starting off at addiction and looking at what the primary culprits are, and I don't want to say culprits. I don't want to make it say culprits. The term that I want to use is look at the elements that make up addiction, starting with trauma and moving forward to denial, and looking at the 4 levels of trauma. So I'm going to move on. And I'm going to talk about dissociative disorders. And I didn't say dissociative, because I know some people are going to run out here and say, oh, dissociative. No, it's called dissociative disorders. And dissociative disorders are mental disorders that involve experiencing a disconnection and lack of continuity between thought, memories, surroundings, actions, and identity. It sounds like a synonym for denial. This is why I say denial is a symptom, and it's complex. And a lot of people don't even know that they're walking around in denial, and a lot of them, guess what they want? They want the spiritual awakening, and they also want enlightenment, but at the same time, it's certain things that they don't want to look at. Mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. It's like hell no, I ain't looking at that. And they'll put a spin on it. And part of being in denial, like I said, I talked about deception, deceitfulness, rationalization, justification. I talked about that, but blaming is in there too. But let's move on. Okay, when I gave the definition and I said dissociative disorders are mental disorders that involve experiencing a disconnection. Key word, experience. So in other words, a person will fabricate something. They will fabricate an experience that they don't want to experience. Double negative, huh? So let's move on with this here. That involve a lack of continuity between thought, memory, surroundings, action, and identity. Note, people with dissociative disorder escape reality in ways that are involuntary and unhealthy and cause problems in function of everyday life. So remember, if I'm not looking at a situation with no cut, no chaser, then I'm not in reality at all. And I will use my mind thinking to disconnect from reality. And guess what I use eventually? Guess what? How about some drugs? How about some sex? How about some gambling? How about some fantasy? How about fantasy/drama? How about some overeating? Because what these things do, and these are, and there's more, workaholics, people that work all the time, they don't want to look at what's really going on in their lives. Or what's going on in their lives is so painful, check it out, it's so painful that they don't want to feel. Because addiction is a feeling disease. Yes. It affects a person's emotions. It affects a person's spirit. And what happens is, in the development of the fantasy, that's where they begin to create their own reality. And a part of that is becoming disassociative. They become disassociative in their own reality. Excuse me, not their own reality, of reality. And the people and the places and things that surround them. Addiction is not a joke. If you ask me, look, if you ask me, and don't ask me, please don't ask me, 90%, if not 95%, of the human population is walking around in some type of addiction, fantasy land, la-la land, and they want to escape reality. But here's the trick. Everybody is not at the same level of denial. Some people are in more denial than others. Because backing up, the human being can only take so much. The human has to be eased, and most of us, has to be eased into reality. And that's why you see a lot of us on these games, watching these game shows, football, baseball, basketball. We want the comedy because this helps. This supports our own personal denial system that most people have. The most noted people in history, they were able to look at the situations around them No cut, no chaser. That's what they were able to do. And check this out. They were able to look at themselves. They were able to look at themselves and then look at the reality of not only them, of what was going on around them. That's how they were enlightened. A lot of people want to be enlightened. They want to have those spiritual awakenings. But when they get to a certain point about not only themselves, the shame, the guilt kicks in, and they're like, hell no. Let me go get a hamburger. I think I need to get some sex. Give me that dope over there. Let me start drinking. They need to feel good because the shock of reality is too much for them. So let's move on, because I'm on a time limit here. There are 3 types of dissociative disorders. Dissociative identity, dissociative amnesia, dissociative derealization. And I'm going to talk about the latter first. The first one is self-explanatory, dissociative identity. Man, that can range from when, I hear people, like, they be black as hell, right? They be like black, big lips, big nose, afro, and they say, I'm Indian. They say, I'm Indian. I'm anything but themselves. And that's just a mild form. And dissociative amnesia, what has happened is a person has been involved in a traumatic event in one of the levels of trauma, acute, what is it? Let me get my notes over here. Acute, chronic, or complex trauma. And they actually will forget either all of it or certain aspects of that experience. This is what's happening. This is what's happening. In depersonalization, derealization disorder, and remember, depersonalization. And depersonalization is like I personally separate myself. And derealization is not only do I disassociate myself, I say the event didn't happen. It was unwritten. No. Dissociative disorders usually dissociative disorder usually is a way to cope with trauma. Oh, man. Bam. There it go again. It says dissociative disorders, that mean all 3 of them, identity, amnesia, derealization, or depersonalization disorders is usually a way to cope with what? Trauma. The disorders most often form in children. Remember I talked about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and I said it happens to children in a young age. And then it says the disorders form often in children, subjected to, listen, long-term physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. Right. Do you see how denial and trauma plays direct? They're directly involved in what? Addiction. So let's move on. It says, why is denial a common example as a defense mechanism? Well, simply, there's so much pain involved that a person, they can't feel it without becoming mentally and emotionally unstable or destabilized. So in order to save themselves, it's something that kicks out in the subconscious that say, okay, we ain't gonna feel this right now. Or we ain't gonna ever feel it. And that's what happens when it's a defense mechanism. It's there to save the individual or the group. It says when the situation of fact becomes too much to handle, one might cope by refusing to experience it. Bam. A person don't want to experience, or the group don't want to, they said, that's too much right there. That rape was too much. That molestation too much. That my parents putting me in foster care was too much. Then nobody loved me. My husband, my wife walked out on me, or my husband or my wife cheated on me, or I cheated on my husband, or I cheated on my wife, and that's too much. I used up the church's money to buy me a Lexus. It says, by denying reality, one is essentially protecting oneself from having to face and deal with the unpleasant consequences and pain that accompany acceptance or the refusal to admit. Now check this out. Inside the recovery process, in order for the individual to get to recovery, 4 things must take place. It's four hurdles that must be done before a person can enter into recovery. 1, the person has to come out of denial. 2, the person has to admit their situation. 3, the person has to accept their situation. 4, the person has to surrender all of the latter before they can come into recovery. And only through recovery can a person experience enlightenment. They can have spiritual awakenings. Look, the first spiritual awakening will occur inside the denial process. Another spiritual awakening will occur inside the admittance process. Another spiritual awakening will happen in the acceptance process. And notice I said process, because the person will waver in between each phase, back and forth, back and forth. Am I not? Should I not? Is this real? Until they stabilize. And then inside the surrender process. And surrender don't mean resign. Okay, yeah, all this happened to me. I'm an addict. So what? That's resignation. Surrender means to let go and then come up with and to come up with a plan of action, a recovery plan, proven recovery plan. Then, like I said, then will that individual or group be on the road to enlightenment. But it's only through a series of spiritual awakenings. Now I want to back up where it said, here it is. It says, by denying reality, one is essentially protecting oneself from having to face and deal with the unpleasant consequences of pain that accompany acceptance and their refusal to admit. So they refuse to admit. Because if you admit something, the next phase is acceptance. So denial tell me, I ain't admit none of that shit. Matter of fact, I ain't gonna even look at it. I'm not gonna I'm not going to even experience it. I'm not going to bring it real. And what I'm going to use is lying, justification. I'm going to use fantasy. I'm going to use deceitfulness. But it's all self. It's self-deceit. That's why, in my view, a lot of people, man, when they start relapsing, what happens in a relapse process is a person they go into denial again. Some type of denial that's something that they don't want to accept. And then they start the reverse process of recovery. All right, moving on. We almost there, y'all. We almost there. It says, admit. What is admit? To confess, to be true, or to be the case. But check this out. Typically with reluctance. Typically with reluctance. And what's connected to reluctance is denial. They're like, oh, no. Remember I was telling you about the teeter-tottering between between denial, starting at denial, and then admit, then back to denial, then admit, then you stabilize, admit. But some people gonna fall off at admit. They ain't gonna admit that shit. Then it's acceptance. Admit, accept, admit, accept, admit, accept. Some people gonna fall off. Some people gonna go on to surrender. Not resignation, but surrender. And then they'll make the decision to what? To recover. And inside the recovery process comes the enlightenment. Now let's see what happens with enlightenment. So let's say a person has their series of spiritual awakening and they start becoming enlightened, and they can walk around and they in harmony with the birds and the river and the air, and they're in harmony with their environment around them. But they see something or smell something or taste something or feel something, anything that's connected to their senses that can tell them, that can give them a hard time or bring that denial back up again, that's the relapse. They're back into relapse mode. Bam. So let's move on. I'm almost out of time. It says consciousness. To become conscious. And I talked about that earlier. Conscious, an inner feeling or voice acting as a guide to righteousness and to righteousness or wrongness of one's behavior. So in conscious, when you become conscious, you're basically aware of your own behavior. Ain't nobody really got to point it out to you, but if somebody pointed out to you and it resonates with you, then you might cop. You might say, okay, enlightenment, the action. Now notice, enlightenment is an action. The action of enlightening or the state of being enlightened. The action or state of having attained spiritual knowledge or insight. So a lot of times, I mean, even from my own experience, I always thought that I wanted to become spiritual, enlightened, and all this other stuff. Then when I found out it was the feelings and emotions, the vulnerability of being that, I said, like, hell no. Let me go back into denial. Because being spiritual and enlightened to me, from the few spiritual awakenings that I've had, puts the individual in a very vulnerable place and also a lonely place. Because you want to know why? Everybody around you or your group don't want to be spiritual or spiritually awakened. I don't give a damn what nobody say. They don't. Why? Because pride and ego has a lot. You're going to be losing a lot of ego. And ego is a dominant force in everybody I know life. I don't know nobody, except for my mother. She got Alzheimer's. So she ain't got no ego. It's gone. So until you can attain something like that, ego is always going to be at place. And what is ego based on? Ego is based on some past shit. It's based on the individual's accomplishments of their past. I got a PhD. I got a bachelor's. I did this. I did that. It's an individual's past that they bring up into the present. And it may or not be relevant, but inside of enlightenment, it's not relevant. Why? Because ego is connected to the thinking, and so is addiction. Oh, so let me say it. Ego is a direct proponent to addiction, obsessive and compulsive thinking. Yes, it is. That's why if anybody ever challenged somebody's if somebody ever challenged somebody's credentials, you didn't go to Harvard, you failed at Harvard or something like that. I mean, you got a fight coming on. A person that's spiritually enlightened, don't none of that stuff matter. It don't matter. What matters is right now, the here and now. Because that's what a lot of people, especially addicts, have a problem with. So they tend to bring up things I've done to give them a sense of self. Because the self is what people defend. Let me point something out to you about the self. You hear people say, I got to develop a relationship with myself. I got to do this for myself. I got to do that for myself. So I say, I have to develop a relationship with who? Myself. That's two people. Any day, I, self, myself. Two different people. I don't care. 1 + 1 is 2. Add it up. Get you a calculator. Write it down on paper. And the I is the ego. And the self is a whole nother person that you're talking about, and you into a whole different what? Psychosis. In other words, you're damn near crazy. Yeah, I said it and I said it again. Anytime a person talking about, well, you know, I need to take myself out to dinner. I need to take myself out to the movie. I need to take myself, then you might as well masturbate with yourself. Because you own shit. So here's the solution. Well, Sammy, what's the solution, Mr. Guru? Why not just be your damn self? Be yourself. In the here and the now. Most people, and wrapping this bit up, cannot live in the here and now for an extended period of time these days. That I met. So wrapping this up, I got to get ready. I got some things I got to do. So remember, my email is ss2728@netzero.net. Now, my other recovery channel is called Enlightenment Through Addiction and Recovery, which is the name of this video. But however, this video is on Sunni Sammy, so if you type in Sunni Sammy, which I'm going to change my name, I'm going to change my name, then we're going to be on the right thing. But anyway, hit subscribe. And with that, I'm going to put my jam on. Hold up. Let me see if I can put... There it is. Yeah, that came with the keyboard, right? So anyway, you ain't never got to use again. People, places, things, you never have to use again. Recovery is putting your big girl underwear on and putting your big boy underwear on. It's deflation of the ego. And it's walking in your surroundings, being aware. That's all it is. My name is Suni, and see you in the next video. See you in